Hi folks, my name is Dakota Cohen, and in this presentation we're going to be talking about organs, bones, and fats. We're going to be going over traditional recipes and skills for how to create nutrient-dense meals right in your own home. So for the presentation outline, we're going to start off by talking about the three most prevalent myths about organs, bones, and fats that make people feel like they shouldn't eat them. Namely, that animal foods are bad for our health, they're bad for the environment, and it's just unethical. It's immoral to eat them. So I'm going to be going through each of those kind of myths and giving you guys permission, because I really believe that people want to eat these incredibly nutrient dense animal foods, and but there's these three myths that make us feel like we can't do that. We're also going to be going over skills, the basic skills for how to cook with organs, how to cook with bone broth, and how to render fat, things like that. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to go through three of my favorite recipes from my recipe book and show you some pictures and just give you some tips and tricks about how you can start making those in your own kitchen. Okay, starting off with, but aren't animal foods bad for our health? Why are you doing a presentation about organs, bones, and fats? This stuff has been, debunked for the last 100 years. All of our health experts have told us that we shouldn't be eating these things. So to start off with, I want to give you guys a little bit of a riddle, which is what is the most common disease in the world? So you'll be surprised to know that these 10 or so diseases up here are actually not the most common disease. Things like autism, that right now in the United States, this is information that I got from Dr. Zach Bush, who's a triple board certified doctor in the United States. Autism is 1 in 36, asthma is 1 in 10, attention deficit disorder 1 in 8, allergies 25% of the population, diabetes 25%. Infertility is 1 in 3 in males, and in females it's 25%. Major depression is expected to affect at least 50% of the population at one point in their life. Cancer is the same thing. And interestingly enough, according to Dr. Bush, some of the studies that were done on the testing kind of early onset signs for dementia, where they were basically doing brain tissue research to look for some of those early indicators, they found that everyone that they tested in their studies, regardless of age, right from children all the way up to adults and the elderly, everyone they looked at showed some signs of brain degeneration, like 100%. But that one is it's a bit controversial. And so the most common disease in the world, actually, I guarantee you have it, is this. It is dental cavities. So according to the World Health Organization, about 60 to 90% of school-age children have cavities, one or more cavities. And according to them, 100% or almost 100% of adults worldwide have or will have at least some form of tooth decay in their lifetime. Now, that is absolutely insane, because when I first realized this through my research, is that this isn't just a normal thing. This is literally a disease. It's considered a physical degeneration, and it's caused by malnutrition. Now, the interesting thing is, if whenever I ask this question in my live presentations, everybody either sticks up their hand that they've ever had cavities, or that they've had the second problem, which is braces. So I've actually had both of these, and most of the kids in my family have had both of them as well. We're going to get into the connection between how the connection between cavities and braces, and how they're actually both two sides of the same coin. So in the 1930s, there was a dentist by the name of Dr. Weston A. Price. And he started to notice that his patients that were coming into his dental practice were having a lot of tooth decay. And it was his hunch that there was some connection between the diet of the day. This was in the 1930s. This was just on the edge of like modern foods and a lot of changes in the American diet. And so he came up with this hypothesis. By the way, he's a very well-known dentist. He actually wrote the book for the U.S. Navy about dental health, and he he came up with this hypothesis that there was a connection between the quality of the foods that his patients were eating and their dental health. And he also thought there was a connection between, and that was just for their cavities, but he started to notice that there was a connection between the overall health of their, not just their dental health, but their overall health. Even to the point that he started to notice that there were signs that the parents that were coming into his office that had really, really bad dental health, their children seemed to have worse teeth. And there seemed to be a correlation there, but he wasn't sure about how to prove this in a scientific way. And actually, his hypothesis was that it was increasing amounts of animal foods that were causing these problems. So what happened was someone in his family happened to work for the National Geographic, which at that time was, pioneering the world and starting to kind of open up borders into so folks could see what traditional peoples were living like all around the world. Everyone's seen, the naked women in Africa. It was a very novel thing. But to Dr. Weston A. Price, he wasn't so much fixated on the naked women. What he couldn't get over was how all these traditional cultures that were from all over the world, how amazing their teeth were. And one of the comments that came out was that they have teeth as white and straight as piano keys. And so it was through this chance encounter with his nephew's work at the National Geographic that he realized that the way to test his hypothesis is as to whether or not there was a connection between the kinds of food that people were eating and how that was affecting their dental health. He realized that he could basically do controlled studies with these indigenous populations who had been eating the same foods for thousands of years in complete isolation from the modern world. And so what he did is, over the course of 10 years, him and his wife traveled to every inhabited continent, and they studied 14 different tribes. And they did this to try to answer two questions. First off, were these reports true? Were the amazing, pictures of how straight and white their teeth that were coming back through various news channels, were they accurate? Or was it just, some trick of the camera? And secondly, what were they eating? And was there a correlation there? So one of the places he visited was Australia. And these are pictures that him and his wife took themselves. And the process for doing this research was very scientific. They would come into a village, they would approach the elders of the community, and they would request to look at every single man, woman, and child, young and old, in the village, and they would go through their teeth meticulously and count cavities, and also note other dental imperfections and things like that. And they did this in Australia and right around the world. But the amazing thing is that they didn't just do it in the healthy tribes. They also tried to find people that were living nearby that had just moved into a nearby city that had access to the same kinds of foods that were being eaten in North America at that time. And what he found was absolutely astonishing, is that there was tooth decay that he had not seen in his practice, as you can see in these pictures. And we found was the same pattern happened over and over and over again. The peoples that were eating their traditional foods had these amazing straight, white, wide mouths, no dental cavities, very very few dental abnormalities. For example, this woman here was in her 90s when this picture was taken. You can just look how beautiful she is and how healthy she looks. But when he looked at the same genetics, because he was trying to rule out, was that part of the factors? Were these traditional people just more healthy because of something in their genetics? He ruled that out by studying the same time, often the same like the same relatives. The one niece would stay in the traditional village and raise a family. The other one would go to town. And he'd be able to study both these people and count cavities in both these communities and find that genetics was not playing a role. So you can start to see that the first generations that made the switch off of their traditional foods and onto the modern foods, which tend to be high in processed foods, white refined sugars, white refined flours, vegetable oils, canned foods, things like that. He also studied this various peoples in Europe, the people like the Swiss, as well as some folks that lived out on islands. They ate mostly fish and things like that. And this is where the story gets really interesting, is because not only did he find that there was a connection between the health of the foods and the health of their teeth, but he started to notice that there was a correlation or a transference to the second generation who had been on these new modern foods, where they started to have not only tooth cavities, but actually tooth deformities, crooked teeth, cleft palates, problems with their wisdom teeth, all these different things. And so the first generation, all their teeth would fall out. And if those people had children, their children started to have physical deformities. This is another tribe that he visited in North America, Seminole indigenous. Again, you can see it, traditional foods, straight white teeth, wide mouths, wide nostrils, almost a square looking face. And then the second generation, the children who were born to parents who were eating these modern foods, they started to have, for the first time ever, these crooked teeth and a long, narrow face. He also went out to the far north. What's interesting here is that you can kind of see it on this picture here. This man had extreme tooth wear, because one of the practices that the indigenous of the north would do to make their leather clothes nice and soft is the men particularly would chew on them to make the leather soft and supple. But what would happen is that the leather would often become impregnated with grains of sand. So they were essentially chewing on sandpaper. They would literally wear their teeth down almost to the gums. But what was fascinating is that even in that state of extreme wear, there was still, in a lot of the men, there was very few cavities and very few problems with their teeth. And he saw the same problem there. Traditional folks had healthy, straight teeth, even though in this particular case, they were quite worn. The first generation, the folks that were the same genetics, often relatives of the people that were living in the traditional villages, eating the traditional foods, when they would move to a modern city, they would start, drinking alcohol and sugars and white breads and processed grains and canned foods. They started to have terrible, terrible tooth decay. And when they had children, their teeth were physically deformed as well. Africa was another place that he visited. And according to his records, he felt that this particular tribe was one of the healthiest peoples that he had studied of all of the 14 different tribes. And of course, the same problem happened there when they moved to the villages and switched their diets. They started to have terrible tooth decay, and then their children started to have these elongated faces that were, long and narrow, and actually started to jut out. And you could start to see an actual indentation in the middle third of the face, which we'll get into a little bit later. So this picture really shows the difference in the facial structure of the traditional diets versus the second generation diets. on these new modern foods. Okay, so now the big question is, first off, the reports were true. They had answered the first question. The people that were eating these traditional diets were incredibly healthy, not just in terms of their teeth. They were living to, old age, and they were just very, very vital. There's stories of, young children playing in glacier-fed mountain streams, buck naked in the middle of the winter, and they were with no clothes on, and they were totally healthy. When him and his wife had to be bundled up in their furs and wool coats. So the second question is, well, what were they eating? Well, to no surprise, there's a huge variation in the kinds of foods that they're eating. Some of these people had no plant foods. Some of them had few animal foods. Some of them had mostly cooked foods. Some had a large amount of raw food. Some had milk, some didn't. Some had grains, some didn't. Some had fruits, some didn't. But what he noticed was when after he got back and he started compiling all of his research, he started to notice there were certain patterns that were starting to emerge from the data. And what he found was that of all the 14 tribes that he studied, all of them followed 11 principles. And these 11 principles were things like they all ate animal fats and proteins. They all ate animal bones and organs. They all had sacred foods for parents or for different demographic groups. So parents had certain foods that were sacred to them. Babies had certain foods that only babies got to eat. Growing children, teenagers, people that were about to get pregnant, people that were pregnant. Every single demographic in the community had foods that were specific to those, and they were often sacred. They were rituals, and a lot of respect around these foods. What was really surprising is that 30 to 80% of the fat content was, or from the 30 to 80% of the calories came from fat content in the diets of all these different traditional peoples, wherever they were on the planet. They also all had some kind of a high food enzyme product. So something that was basically fermented, things like sauerkraut, fermented milks, fermented grains, beers, sauces, kombucha, things like that. There was something that they ate with a lot of their foods that the people, there was pairings where only certain foods were eaten together, and very deliberately. There's also an almost equal amount of omega 3 to 6 fatty acids. And so what happens was when the omega 3 to 6 ratios get out of balance, is it tends to cause a lot of inflammation in the body. But when they're close to 1-to-1, there doesn't tend to be a lot of that problem. They also all tended to have a lot of raw or some kind of raw animal products, whether it was raw milk or raw meat or raw insects or raw fish or something like that. They all had some kind of or even raw blood. And the eighth principle was that when he brought these foods back to his lab in North America, he was able to test the nutrient density of foods that were being grown in these traditional villages, and compare those to the same kinds of foods that were being grown on North American farms. Things like oats or rye or milk, or certain vegetables. And what he found was that when he tested the same foods that were grown in traditional agricultural villages versus the foods that were grown on the modern and industrializing farms in the United States, he found that there was 4 to 10 times the amount of minerals and fat soluble vitamins, things like calcium, vitamin K2, A, D, stuff like that. The ninth principle is that any culture that ate seeds, grains, and nuts all soaked, sprouted, or fermented them, sometimes several combinations of those before they ate them. So, the Seminole Indians, they would, mash up their corn and ferment it with lye. The Swiss folks would ferment rye bread for up to 2 weeks before they would eat it. And a lot of the indigenous folks of Africa had very elaborate ways of making beers and fermented beverages out of the legumes and things there. The 10th principle was that they all had some source of salt, whether that was coming from the food directly, like things like blood or eating the gallbladder, or some other part of the animal that happened to be high in salt, or if they were actually mining or dehydrating salt from the ocean or finding a salt spring somewhere. But salt tended to be a very sacred food, particularly for the storage and processing of foods as well. And the 11th principle was that there was no refined or denatured foods in their diets whatsoever. So beyond fermentation and cooking, there was no other form of processing that these foods were undergoing. So they were as close to natural as possible. And so what is really interesting is that when you look at those foods, you can see how few of these principles are followed today. I mean, we're told by our medical experts, don't eat animal fats and proteins. Don't eat animal organs. They're dangerous. They could be toxic. There's a little bit of sacred foods for our babies. The special foods is basically just the same foods that we eat. It's just blended up. But other than that, everybody eats the same things regardless of their age. We're told to be terrified of fat, and there's very few high food enzyme products anymore, apart from beer, which a lot of the beer actually is pasteurized. Our ketchups, our sauerkrauts, things that were traditionally fermented are now actually pasteurized and canned, pickles, stuff like that. When we start doing testing on the omega-6 to 3 fatty acids, we find that they're way out of whack. We've actually had our own grass-fed beef and eggs and pork tested on our farm for the omega-3 to 6 ratio, and they're almost 1-to-1. Versus you compare that to animals that are raised on factory farms, and they can be as high as 40-to-1. 40 times the amount of inflammatory omega fatty acids. Raw animal products are just, it would be outrageous to, and in some cases illegal to sell or consume any of these raw animal products. And in terms of the mineral and vitamins in our foods, there's no really talk about that anymore. We're just told to take vitamins and minerals and things like that. And of course, our seeds and grains are rarely sprouted anymore. Salt, we're told to fear salt like it's the plague, and minimize it. And even a lot of the salt that we're eating is highly refined, so a lot of the minerals have been taken out of it, and it's just pure NaCl. And of course, our diets are filled with non-refined, with refined and denatured foods. So, what's interesting is that is it really such a shock that given the patterns that he was seeing in the 1930s, why we're seeing so many dental cavities, 60 to 90% of school-age children, 100% of adults with some form of cavity, and the huge booming industry right now in braces and things like that. And so if we actually go through, you can access this chart if you'd like to take a closer look at it, from the Price Pottinger Foundation, which shows all the different 14 tribes and the comparison between the traditional, which is in the white, and the modernized foods and what they were eating, but also the percentage of cavities in the population. So in some of these tribes, they were going from almost 0% to 6 or 7, 40%, 70%. They were, all of them were a 10, 20, 30, 100 times or more increase in the number of cavities from the traditional to the modern type foods, which is just absolutely outstanding. So we're going to get into some of the research that Dr. Weston A. Price was able to do into those foods and why this is happening, and also what we can what we can do about it to help reclaim our health. But before we do that, I just want to talk about another fellow who, as you can see, from the Price Pottinger Foundation. So Dr. Price is obviously the Price portion of that, and Dr. Pottinger is the other side. So Dr. Pottinger was another doctor around the same time who was specializing in treating of tuberculosis, asthma, and other lung-related diseases. And he, by accident, started to do research on cats that he didn't mean to. So he was actually using these cats in his studies for these lung diseases. But if anybody who's ever had cats, that once you got one or two cats, you've got hundreds of cats, because first off, those two cats start to breed, and very, very rapidly you start to have they start to have babies. But also, when other people see how many cats you have, they think, oh wow, this person really likes cats, I'm going to give them all of my cats, and they just drop boxes of cats off on your door. And this is exactly what happened with Dr. Pottinger. Is that in his lab, he had a special area that he kept all of his cats in, and fed them very special diets of typically 2/3 raw meat, 1/3 raw milk, and cod liver oil, and that was a very controlled diet so that he could rule out any changes in diet in the other studies that he was doing. But at a certain point, he started to have hundreds of cats at his facility, and because people kept dropping off cats, they were breeding. And at one point, he ran out of the food that he was feeding these cats, and he was forced to go to a nearby butcher shop to get more of the raw meat. Unfortunately, the butcher shop was totally out of raw meat, and so they said, we've got some this new product. It's cooked meat, and you can have some of that. So he said, sure. He took it back to his lab. And the cats that he was doing his studies on, he kept feeding those the same diet of raw meat, raw milk, and raw cod liver oil. And the other cats that were just he was basically being kind to and trying to give them a good home, he fed them kind of whatever he had laying around, which was this cooked meat along with the raw milk and the raw cod liver oil. And something very interesting happened. Is that within a very short period of time, he started to notice a difference in these two groups of cats that was outside of his original study. And he actually shifted his focus and started doing a lot more studies on this. And he kind of left the lung disease stuff aside. What he found was that in the first generation that were on this new diet of the cooked meat, he found that in the first generation, they started to become lazy and develop similar degenerative diseases to humans late in life. So things like arthritis, bad teeth, receding gum lines, stuff like that. But when those cats started to have babies, so the cats that were eating this cooked meat and the raw milk and the raw cod liver oil, when they started to have babies together, those babies, they were the second generation, they started to become lazy and develop degenerative diseases in midlife as opposed to the late in life. And they start to be a loss of coordination. You can actually look up videos of this online where they show some of the tests that they did, which were probably would not be allowed to go on today because of the unethical nature of it. But there's a saying that cats always land on their feet, no matter which way you throw them. Well, that was one of the tests that he used to track the coordination of these cats. Is he would basically spin them in the air a few feet off the ground, a number of times, and he would count the number of times they landed on their feet, because that was a metric for coordination. And what he found was that the second generation was starting to show signs of a loss of coordination compared to the control group, which was still being fed the raw milk, raw meat, and the raw cod liver oil. Now, when that second generation started to have babies together, and that became the third generation, they started to become lazy and develop degenerative diseases early in life, and they started to have a shortened lifespan altogether. They also started to notice that the kittens that were born were blind, A lot of them were blind. There's also a difficulty in conceiving babies, so there's low fertility. The cats also started to have increased allergies, and they even started to have physiological changes. So the shapes of their skulls started to change, the size of their teeth, the density of their bones. And what was even more interesting is that there was personality changes. So the male cats started to become more like females, and the females started to become more like males. So the males became really docile and non-aggressive, and the females were the opposite. And by the fourth generation, so when those third generation cats started to have babies, there was 100% mortality of the offspring within 6 months. So the question is, what was missing from their diet? Because that was the only variable that these cats were facing. And what happened to be missing was a single amino acid called taurine, which happens to be denatured or destroyed when meat is cooked. And so all modern cat food that comes in a little bag now has this enzyme added into the cooked food, so it doesn't, because if it's not cooked, it goes bad. But it's very simple, easy to fix. But they didn't know this in the 1930s, and so that was the only variable that was missing for the foods was a single amino acid. And so when we look at the 11 principles of these traditional diets and all the different things they were eating and all the things that we're told not to eat today, specifically, which again, the amazing thing is that the first 7 of these principles all relate to animal foods of some kind. So over half of the principles of these traditional peoples were related to animal organs, bones, and fats, and yet we're told not to eat those today. So is it any wonder why all the things that are missing from our diets today, and the incredible changes that happen with a single ingredient missing in their diets, is it any wonder why we're facing the incredible disease epidemic where 60% of deaths worldwide are from degenerative diseases? So the question is, how many more generations can we last? Cats breed a lot faster than we do. It can be a couple months from the time a kitten is born until it can be bred, and that's one generation. For humans, that generation is about 20 years. And so when we look at the 1930s, which is when Weston A. Price started to do his research, and that was basically the first generation that were eating these new foods that were obviously missing some kind of nutrient. We can count 20, 40, 60 years. And right now we are in the midst of the fourth generation. So what are we seeing? We're seeing, increased allergies, increased degenerative diseases, shortened lifespan. We're starting to see incredible infertility rates in males and females. The same things that were happening to those cats. So this really comes to why organs, bones, and fats. And relating this back to the missing ingredients is that there are certain nutrients that are only found in animal products. Now, the very first one, vitamin A, and actually a lot of the other ones are very controversial. And I don't have time to get into the science of all this stuff. I'm going to encourage you guys to go and do some research of your own about this. But there's an incredible amount of misinformation about which nutrients are found in foods and which aren't. And there's certain vitamins that are precursors to vitamins, and they might be found in non-animal foods that our bodies have the ability to convert into the true form of vitamin A, things like beta carotene. But at the end of the day, they're not the same, and they, for example, in vitamin A, they require other nutrients for our bodies to be able to manufacture them. And according to doctors that work with the Weston A. Price, the young children do not have that ability. So it's only in adults, and only in adults that are super healthy, and only in emergency situations can our bodies convert some of these nutrients. But other things like vitamin B12, cholesterol, fatty acids, they're only found in animal foods. And there's other nutrients that are also found in plants foods, but they are more easily assimilatable into our bodies when they're found in animal products. Things like calcium, vitamin B6, magnesium, iron, zinc, copper. And so this is a really simple analogy to think about vitamins and minerals, is that the minerals are like bricks, and the vitamins are like the mortar that holds them together. And so imagine your body as a building made out of bricks. And this is an excellent analogy because it's literally true. Every cell, bone, organ, tissue in our body is made out of vitamins and minerals. Now, just like in a building, once it's built, that's one thing, but you also have to maintain it. You have to paint the walls. You have to repair the brickwork. You have to reshingle it. You have to make sure that the windows are stained and that your decking is looked after. You need ongoing materials to make sure that the house doesn't degenerate. And so now the other interesting thing is that the enzymes here, which is one of the principles, all these traditional cultures had some kind of enzyme. What do enzymes do? They're catalysts. They help create efficient reactions between other things. So you can think of those like power tools. So you've got your vitamins, minerals, or your bricks and your mortar, or your mortar and your bricks, and these enzymes are like the power tools that help us build even faster and more efficiently. So what happens when our bodies are being built, literally in our mother's womb, our mother is eating foods and extracting vitamins and minerals and enzymes from those foods that are being used to literally build our body. And one of the first bones, for whatever reason, that starts to become affected when there's a shortage of materials, because just like when you're building a house, if you don't have enough materials, if you don't have enough bricks and mortar, you can't build a full house. You have to start cutting corners, making the house smaller. So the same thing happens in the human body. And for whatever reason, one of the first corners that gets cut is this purple bone in the middle third of our face called the maxilla. For whatever reason, it starts to shrink, likely because it's not necessary for the survival and procreation of our species. There's something called the biological effect in natural systems, which is when an organism is stressed and it thinks it's not going to make it, it puts all of its energy into reproduction, because even though that organism might not survive itself, it tries to kind of put all of its effort into the next generation, and so it kind of basically robs itself of its own potential to ensure the continuation of its genes. It's called the biological effect. So this is what starts to happen in our bodies is we start to the maxilla starts to shrink, and then other things start to shrink. We start to shrink in height. Bone density starts to go down. Just like in the cats, our physiology starts to change. Even the pelvic openings goes from round to oval. And but talking specifically about this maxilla bone in our heads, almost every single bone in our skull attaches to this or touches this maxilla bone. And so when it starts to shrink, it literally pulls everything else. You start to get the middle third of the face starts to get that characteristic indent we saw in those pictures of the second generation traditional peoples. And you start to get, no room for your wisdom teeth, crowded, crooked teeth, same kinds of things. And again, just like in a house, we talked about, even if you build a really nice house, if you don't have the materials to maintain it, the house starts to fall apart. And so you start to see the really common sense connection between physiological degeneration, cavities, and then physiological deformities. These are just a continuation of the same thing. And we actually know this. Like there's very common phrases in or sayings that we have. The mouth is the window to your health. Never look a gift horse in the mouth, which is an old saying, because the way that farmers used to judge the health of an animal, particularly horses, is they would look into their mouth. That's also the same way you judge the age of an animal. You look into their mouth to see how much wear and tear on their teeth. and the reason you would the saying, you never look a gift horse in the mouth. The reason they say that is because if somebody gives you a horse, it's a horse. It's an incredibly valuable gift. Why would you want to look into its mouth to examine how good it is? It's like somebody giving you this beautiful painting or something else like that, and you're like, oh, that's I wonder how much this is worth, right? So that's that saying came, is because we've known traditionally that the mouth is the window into our health. And so Dr. Weston A. Price and the folks at the Weston A. Price Foundation have found correlations between straight teeth and what that means for other portions of our body, and crooked teeth. So straight teeth, you've got lots of room. There's in your head for your glands, your pineal, your hypothalamus. You've got good skeletal development, good muscles, keen eyesight and hearing, optimal function of the organs. You actually tend to have a really good outlook on life. And I mentioned this before, but there's actually a round pelvic opening for easy birthing. One of the common themes that came across in all the traditional cultures was the relative ease of childbirth. There's stories about a woman laying down next to a pregnant woman laying down next to her husband at night, and in the morning when the husband woke up, he was introduced to his new baby. He slept right through the childbirth because it was so easy and painless. Which again, this is not what we hear about our history. Is that childbirth was incredibly dangerous and a lot of women died. And now those are stories from modernized cultures. The European type nations. This is not necessarily the case for traditional peoples, and we see that with crooked teeth. There was a complete inverse of all those problems. So I know you're probably thinking, well, this is very anecdotal, that like this is all these stories and observations and looking at people's teeth. This is old hat. We've got science now today that can prove all this stuff, and it's just all wishy-washy. And so what about all those studies that have been done? Well, I just like to point out that for a long period of time, the science said something completely different. This was an ad by the Lard Information Council in the early 1900s. They're happy because they eat lard. Lard and fats were a huge part of our culture, and so much so that during the war, fats were actually used to make ammunitions, explosives, and things like that. And people had to be essentially threatened or coerced into saving their fats, not eating them. Fry your bacon and put it into a can and bring it to your meat dealer so that we can, for the war effort. It was a measure of austerity that you are sacrificing something of value to contribute to the greater good. Now, today, of course, after almost 100 years of incredible propaganda by some very insidious organizations, this is an advertisement by the World Health Federation that is making a comparison between butter and razor blades. This is another ad where there's a lovely plate of cheese here on a table that's actually a mousetrap. What's going to happen when you eat some of that cheese and all the fat that's associated with that? This is at the International Food Council just a few years ago, begging people, please don't switch out your vegetable oil for lard. It's almost like there's something that they see the resurgence back to this, but they're begging people, don't go back to it. Even things like Time Magazine, over the course of just a few decades, there was all this information about how bad cholesterol is for us. But now, years later, scientists labeled fat the enemy. Why were they wrong? We're starting to see a change in the story of science. And I'd also like to point out a really simple analogy is what do all these things have in common? Things like Agent Orange, PCBs, DDT, glyphosate, aspartame, RBGH, and dioxin. All these things have at least two things in common. So the first thing is that they were all manufactured by the exact same company, a company known as Monsanto. Now they've been bought up by the European company Bayer, but all these chemicals were made by the same company. And the other interesting thing is that every single one of them was proven by science to be totally safe. It was advertised for years. Agent Orange was the defoliant that was used in the Vietnam War. PCBs were chemicals that were told were totally safe. DDT was a herbicide that was used again in the early 1900s, but when it was linked to the deaths of falcons, particularly peregrine falcons, and the thinning of their eggshells, it was banned. Aspartame, these are aspartame and glyphosate there's still a little bit of hesitancy on that, but there's a huge amount of research showing the incredible dangers of aspartame, which is the artificial sweetener, and glyphosate, which is a herbicide. I'll talk more about that later. RBGH, also known as bovine growth hormone, which was a chemical that's actually banned in Canada, but in the United States, it's basically a hormone that's injected into dairy cows to increase their milk production. And what it does is it basically tricks the cow's body into producing, into thinking it has an infection in its mammary gland, so it increases production. The problem is that the milk basically has pus in it and is very unhealthy. And there's incredible amounts of research and scientists that were lost their jobs and were blowing the whistle about the dangers of these things, but yet they're still used today. Same thing with dioxins. So just taking one of these, for example, which is glyphosate, which is still, even though the World Health Organization states that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen, and it's been proven now in several courts of law around the world, where people, particularly there's a groundskeeper in the United States who developed, I believe it was pancreatic cancer, and he proved in a court of law that he developed cancer as a result of working with glyphosate, even though it was told to be safe. There's ads that it was safe as basically drink it, it was biodegradable, all these different things. Science and these companies told us it was totally safe. Yet when you look at the patent numbers of this herbicide called glyphosate, we find that in the 1960s, it wasn't a herbicide at all. It was actually a chelating agent. It was a chemical that was flushed through pipes in factories to basically descale, pull minerals away from the edge of the pipes and flush it out the other end. That was its original purpose. But somebody must have noticed that, hey, when this stuff comes out the other side of the pipe, it kills all the plants on the other side. Maybe this could be used as a herbicide. And that's just what happened. In 1968, it was patented. You can look all these numbers up yourself. There's a US patent for Roundup being used as a herbicide in the 1960s. Then, in 2003, it was patented not only as an antimicrobial, something that kills microbes, but also as a biocide. A biocide, bio meaning life, side meaning kill, it literally means it kills all life. And we're told that this chemical is safe enough to drink. It's biodegradable. And it is one of the most widely used chemicals in the world. I believe for every person on the planet today, every year there is about 1 kilogram of herbicide sprayed per person worldwide. And if you look at the MSDS sheets for glyphosate, consuming half a liter of this is considered a lethal dose. Here in Alberta, Canada, because we're an agricultural population and there's very few people that live, only about 5 million people, there's over 15 million kilograms of this herbicide that's sprayed every year in Alberta. The other interesting thing about glyphosate is that it's water soluble. It's incredibly persistent. The half-life of glyphosate is about 25 years. And when it breaks down, it doesn't become safe. Halfway through that, in 25 years, it doesn't become safer, it becomes more dangerous. It's incredibly persistent. It is literally patented as something that binds minerals, kills plants, kills microbiology, and kills all life. And yet, according to the US Geological Survey records, they're spraying it almost hundreds of pounds per square kilometer, or hundreds of pounds per acre every year for a huge portion of the United States. And again, because it's water soluble, it gets into the hydrological cycle. We're drinking it in our factories. And there's some excellent research that's been done by Dr. Zach Bush, who has shown that since the widespread use of Roundup, with the increasing use of Roundup, which is linked not only to things like celiac disease, but also to the incredible shift of cancer zones where the cancers used to congregate around the more populated areas, like along the coastlines. There used to be a lot more cancers there, but now there's been a complete reversal of the cancer frequencies, and now they mimic the hydrological patterns of the United States. So the further you go downstream, the more there are cancers there are. It's no longer associated with industry. It's associated with agriculture and watersheds. And of course, there's other factors that are interacting together. But by their own admission, these are things that bind minerals, which are the building blocks of our bodies. They kill plants. They kill microbiology, which again, there's a whole other level of our microbiome that's involved. And they're just deadly. They've been proven to cause cancer in the court of law. And so if folks want to do some more research into this, you'll find that a lot of the science that is thrown out there about how dangerous animal foods are, they are either mistaken anecdotal observations, they are limited term trials that they'll study mice for a short period of time and say, oh no, these foods are totally safe. They'll take food components tested in isolation when they're typically used together, so they'll extract a singular component of animal food that is not natural, and they'll feed that to a rat and it'll get sick. Or they'll even take food-like substances instead and test those, or inject them into the bloodstream. They'll isolate a molecule from milk, and instead of letting the mouse or the test subject consume it, they'll inject it into their bloodstream, and it'll kill them or cause all these kinds of problems. So there's all of this really fake science that has been incredibly well documented, the cherry picking, the falsifying data by none other than Sally Fallon in her incredible books, Nourishing Diets, Nourishing Fats, Nourishing Bone Broth, as well as her incredible recipe book. She has many YouTube videos online. I was able to interview her a couple years ago about her newest book. It's available on my website, cohenfarm.ca/resources, on my blog there. I've also got a link to some of her other incredible YouTube presentations you can watch on my website that go through. There's a really good one called The Oiling of America, which shows the incredible conspiracy between government and industries to ram this belief that fats were bad for us down our throats. And so when we look at all the science, we find that it's utter garbage. Things like the China study and Ansel Keys and the food pyramids and things like that were really very seditious and manipulative attempts that were sponsored by big industries to try to get us away from our traditional foods onto these modern foods that were highly processed, cheap to produce, stored for a long time, and I believe took away our food sovereignty from us. So another question you might be asking is, well, what about the food guides? That's kind of the culmination of all the science. It's not just an independent study here. It's our very governments are publishing. They're looking at all the studies and saying, no, this is what you should eat to be healthy. Well, what about the food guides? So again, we see that the food guides have not always reflected what they are today. Which, if you actually track the changes, you can see every year the portion of meat and dairy decreases, and the portion of vegetables and grains and processed foods increases. But at one point, we can see here that folks were told to eat liver, heart, or kidney once a week. This is Canada's official food rules. And then fast forward a couple of years, and we see that a fresh liver oil is a source of vitamin D and should be given to children and expectant women. It may be advisable for other adults. We're told that we should consume liver frequently. And then we fast forward to the 1960s, and there's no mention of liver anymore. And every year, that's not true. In 1961, eat liver occasionally. So we went from eat liver frequently to we went from eating liver liver, heart, and kidney once a week, to eating just liver frequently, to eating it occasionally. And now there's no mention of organs on our food guides. And we're told to stay away from saturated fats. There's no mention of bone broths even in any of these food guides here. So what these food guides really amount to is a culmination of all of the propaganda and misinformation that has been put out by these incredibly massive corporations that have been designed to essentially turn humans into the very shape of the pyramid itself. So we can see here, the wonderful correlation between the Kellogg's, the Cargills, the Krafts, the Tysons, and of course our Coca-Colas and processed sugar companies. So if you want one final piece of proof that our governments do not have our own best interest in mind, and that they're incredibly subjective or influenceable by big industry, just months after the World Health Organization labeled glyphosate as a probable carcinogen, and there was proven in courts of law that glyphosate was causing cancer in at least several cases. At the same time, the Canadian government published their new food guide, which it doesn't say eat meat; it says eat protein foods. What's a protein food? Make water your drink of choice. No longer any milk on the plate here. There's actually no dairy whatsoever. And look at the huge amount of vegetables on this plate. So what we can see here is that on around the same time that the Canada published this new food guide, they also came out with this wonderful article in the Western Producer that says, Health Canada says unbiased assessment, in quotations, clears glyphosate of any wrongdoing. So the same organization that's telling us what to eat is telling us that a known carcinogen, who's been patented to bind minerals that are essential, things like calcium, magnesium, manganese, that blocks those up, makes them unavailable, kills plants, kills microbiology, and kills all life, totally safe. So as you start to dig into the history of the manipulation and the misinformation that has been we've been subjected to all around the world by our governments in cooperation with huge businesses, you'll find that suddenly these observations that were made in the 1930s were not so shocking or hard to believe after all. So what I find that's really interesting is that these traditional peoples had no dentists, no floss, no toothbrush, no healthcare. They didn't have electricity a lot of times. They lived in some cases literally mud huts or sawed roofs and things like that, and they had no health problems. They're living to 80, 100 years old with almost zero tooth decay, let alone all the other illnesses that we're plagued by today. And yet today, we've got 10 different kinds of floss, hundreds of different kinds of tooth. There's aisles of just dental products. You can have extra soft, hard, firm. There's toothbrushes that cost $100 or more. There's fluoride in the toothpaste, which incidentally is actually made by the same company, Procter & Gamble, that was one of the major drivers in getting traditional saturated fats out of our diets and introducing vegetable fats. Well, that's a whole other story. We've got free healthcare here in Canada and most places in the world, and we've got all kinds of problems. And so if somebody ever asks you the question, why the long face? As you can see here in Keanu Reeves, who really kind of epitomizes the miserable, depressed, long-faced, crooked teeth, angsty, modern human in our culture. When somebody asks you why the long face, you can say, well, it's because our health and vitality has been stolen from us by the politically correct diet dictocrats. And I believe that's literally what's happened, is we have been robbed of our birthright by corporations and corrupt governments. Okay, so that's the health piece, but are animal foods bad for us? Well, obviously they're not. Every traditional culture that's ever existed has always eaten them. They might not have eaten meat, but they always ate some kind of animal food with it, even if it was just insects or milk or something like that. So that's the first kind of myth out of the way. So that'll give you permission to return to these traditional foods. But of course, the other one is, well, but even if they're good for us, animals are bad for the planet. They're bad for the environment. Look at all the factory farms that are causing all the dead zones in the oceans and all these different things. Well, again, this is another modern problem. When we look back again at traditional ecosystems and traditional cultures, we find that, first of all, the way that we're raising animals in terms of agriculture is very different than a few hundred years ago. But also, if we look back farther into research that was done by Charles C. Mann in his book 1491 and by Dan Flores' American Serengeti, we find that there was more animals in most parts of the world, hundreds of years ago than there are today. So the idea that animals are bad for the environment is utterly ridiculous. And we can very easily point this out by just thinking about what are the 4 ingredients of agriculture to produce any kind of agricultural product, whether it's food, fiber, pharmaceuticals, or fuel. There's only 4 of them, and it's sunlight, it's water, it's soil, and it's organisms, flora and fauna, plants and animals. And all those ingredients, they basically, so the flow looks like this. Sunlight comes down, it combines with water and carbon. The plants produce, they pull minerals out of the soil, they produce some kind of a leaf that harvests all that stuff. It grows really big, and a human eats that plant or an animal eats that plant, and the whole thing gets better and bigger and more productive over time. And so animals are obviously an essential part of ecosystems for numerous reasons, particularly for the nutrient cycle and recycling plants, building the phosphorus levels. They're also incredibly important for certain plants can't actually live without animals, without spreading their seeds, helping them to germinate, things like that. So when we look at modern industrial agriculture, which is, you can see this is our farm near Farintosh, Alberta, on the left side here. This is an industrial farm that grows plants. So this farm only produces plants. This one produces mostly animals and the plants that those animals eat. Which one of these farms is healthier? And so when we fast forward, this picture was taken May 24th. Which one of them is harvesting more sunlight? Which one of them is harvesting more water? Which one of them has more biodiversity? Which one of them has more soil health? You can see the soil erosion in this picture. You can see the degraded riparian areas. You can see the loss of biodiversity. You can see the lack of solar harvesting that's happening. Green leaves are required for photosynthesis. There's none happening here. Now we fast forward to June 17th, just a few days before the longest day of the year. Same picture. Our farm on the left, industrial plant farm on the right. On almost the longest day of the year where you could harvest the most solar energy, these plants are barely out of the ground. They're not pulling carbon out of the air. Fast forward to the end of August. We see, again, our farm still green. This is actually taken in one of the worst droughts in almost half a century in our county. Yet our farm is still green, still photosynthesizing. There's still animals out grazing around. You can see our dairy cows here in the pasture, and our beef cows would be out somewhere else. Our pigs and chickens are on our integrated livestock system there. On the other side, that crop is already been baled. It's stopped harvesting. Once annual crops produce seed, they stop photosynthesizing. And they stop putting those 4 ingredients of agriculture into productive use. And so you can see right away that the observation that animals are bad for the environment is utterly ridiculous. What it really comes down to is it's the how, not the cow. This is really important. I am in complete opposition to factory farming and degenerative livestock agriculture. They are incredibly bad for the environment, and they're also incredibly bad for the animals. But to make the blanket statement that all animals are bad and that cows are causing global warming is utterly ridiculous. There are almost as many bison in North America as there are beef cattle today. And so you can't make these jobs in the same way that all traditional peoples always ate meat. There were more animals 200 years ago than there are now. So there obviously has to be another factor here, which is how the animals are being raised, not the animals themselves. This is a critical piece, and there's an intimate connection between the nutrient density of our food and the health of the ecosystem that it was grown in. Because again, the soil minerals, they can only get up into the plants if the soil is healthy, and if there's a healthy water cycle, and all of those things feed back on each other to create more biodiversity, which increases the amount of nutrient density in the soil, which increases the nutrient density of the food, which in the grass, which increases the nutrient density of the meat, and all of these things spiral together. But because of our warped sense of our place in the world as being top of the food chain, we're literally destroying our planet and ourselves in the process. And so we need to make a shift in our paradigm about what our place is from ecological to ecological. And when we do that, we are going to have an increase in the nutrient density of our food. And so just to go into this a little bit more, in a little bit more detail, there's, in terms of why there's this nutrient density loss, we can see there is very good evidence. Dr. Weston A. Price in the 1930s, he saw there was a 4 to 10 times decrease in nutrient density. Dr. D. Thomas was comparing data from the 1940s. So after Dr. Weston A. Price, from 1940s to 1991, he found there was in some cases 100% decrease in the amount of certain vitamins, certain minerals, and a decrease in almost all these essential minerals. Again, these are the building blocks of life. And so when we look back at what's causing that, we find that there's literally been a war on our soil, a war on our ecosystems, that you can see every decline in the nutrient density of our food corresponded to an increasing in the mechanization and the industrialization of modern agriculture. And this literally is a war. Our tanks have become tractors, our bombs, the nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus that is used to make ammunitions is now used to make fertilizer. Our mustard gas, which were used at the beginning of at the end of the First World War, they turned into the precursors for our pesticides. Bayer was a company that made the mustard gas and the other gases that were used to exterminate the Jewish people in the concentration camps. Now it's the company that produces our medicines to heal us and our pesticides and herbicides to grow our food for us. And of course, our atomic bombs at the end of the Second World War and our ability to manipulate elements at the molecular level, they turned into our genetically modified organisms, which connects back to our glyphosate, which was a lot of plants have been genetically engineered to resist glyphosate. So you can spray Roundup or glyphosate on things like soybeans, cotton, corn, potatoes, things like that, and it won't kill those plants because they've been altered molecularly to be able to survive, and yet it'll kill everything else around it. And so, what is that doing to the plant? The plant itself is being sprayed with a chemical that is known to be toxic and bind minerals and kill all life. And then we get into how glyphosate is also being used as a desiccant now. So because farms are so big now, it takes so long to harvest. Typically, when we look back, say at this picture here, you can see where all the swaths used to be. So this used to be a field of solid grain. A swather comes by and cuts it all down and makes it into a swath or a windrow. And then a combine comes along and chews up that swath or that windrow, threshes the grain from the straw, spits the straw at the other end, which you can then bale it, which is what they've done here. But because farms are so big now, farmers don't have time to do those two steps. They can't swath it, which helps the grain to dry down so the threshing and the combine works properly. So what they do is they go through and they spray the crop while it's still standing. And what do they spray it with? They spray it with Roundup, with glyphosate, which kills the plant so that it's dead and it's still standing, so it dries faster and it saves time so the farmers can harvest them. It's called desiccation. This is a modern agricultural practice. Luckily now, because of the incredible evidence that this is linked to all kinds of gut disorders, celiac disease, and everything else, there's now talk of banning that practice. But since the 1990s, that was the norm. And if we look back at this chart here, we can see again, it's not, correlation is not necessarily causation, but there's when we know what glyphosate does to our microbiome and that it is an antimicrobial, what's happening with a celiac disease? It's a gastrointestinal disorder. So of course there has to be some kind of a connection there. It might not be the only factor, but it certainly plays a role. And so you can see that the nutrient density of our food is directly related to the health of our ecosystems. And our current plant-based agricultural system, which whether these plants are grown to be fed to animals in barns or grown to be fed humans, which are in barns or cities, it's the same thing. It's not a healthy ecosystem. It's the how, not the cow. These animals shouldn't be fed grain in a barn. They should be fed grass and in their natural diets out in a healthy environment like this, where their nutrients can go directly back onto the ground, which produces more grass and healthier grass every single year. So, of course, it's with a little bit more of a careful look, it's clear to see that animals are not bad for the environment. They're essential for the environment, and they're essential for the healing of the environment as well. Okay, now the third myth, which is that it's unethical to kill animals. It's immoral. Now, I'd like to just read one of the quotes from one of my favorite authors, Mr. Wendell Berry, which is that to live, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. And we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently. It is a sacrament. And when we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, and destructively, it is a desecration. So I believe that all life is sacred, whether it is a plant or an animal. And that regardless of what we eat, it is important to eat it skillfully, lovingly, and reverently. And so I am in complete opposition to factory farming and suffering of the needless suffering of animals. But I'm also against the factory farming of plants and the needless suffering of those. And you might say, well, there's a difference between plants and animals, and one of them is conscious and one of them isn't. And this is something that is very, very up until recently was kind of a cut and dried thing, but now because of studies that are being done that you can look up in terms of a book called The Secret Life of Trees, or documentaries like Smarty Plants or The Secret Life of Plants, we start to see that through various experiments, plants have the ability to make decisions. They have the ability to have memory. They have the ability to show preferential treatment towards their own young. They have the ability to share nutrients communally, and which is almost the idea of kind of planning ahead. And they're also showing signs of being able to make decisions, and that I won't go through all the experiments there and how they're proving these things, but for me, all of those aspects show signs of consciousness. And without getting too much into the details, if you ask these traditional cultures, whether or not plants were alive, they would laugh at you. Of course they're alive. Of course the shamanistic cultures of indigenous peoples all around the world saw plants and animals as our teachers and as our guides, And they were both incredibly important for our diets as well as our spiritual lives. And so I believe that if we eat well, take for example this picture here, this is how we harvest our animals on our farm. There's no feedlots, there's no stress, there's no a lot of farmers say, my animals only have one bad day, and that's the day that they get shipped off farm to the factory, the slaughter farm. Our animals don't have a single bad day. Every single day they wake up from they're born on our farms, and they are harvested on our farms, and is done in a lovingly, skillfully, reverently, sacred manner. And when it is done that, I believe there is no argument that it is unethical to eat animals. Life requires death to feed it. And just as Wendell Berry says here, when we do that with good intentions, and with skill, it is a testament. It is a tribute to life. It is not the opposite. And so it's not what you eat; it's how you eat it, and that's the distinction here. Now, another reason why animals' organs, bones, and fats are so important is because almost 50% of most animals that we eat are organs, bones, and fats. And if you're not eating that, then that animal is dying a life that isn't being appreciated. Half of it's going to waste. So most of the nutrients are in the organs, bones, and fats. And those are the things that we're told to throw away. And I think that's very, very disrespectful for an animal that's giving its life so that we can live. So right there, we just unpacked those three myths: that animals are bad for our health, animals are bad for the environment, and that animals it's unethical to eat animals. And I believe I've done a reasonably good job of giving you guys permission to start eating some of these foods that you've probably wanted to all along, but you felt guilty about eating them. So now I want to go through some of the skills, really basic stuff about how you can start incorporating organs, bones, and fats back into your life, learning some of these traditionals, because it's really not that complicated. And then we're going to finish off with my 3 favorite recipes, so that you can start making some of these things in your own homes. Okay, we're starting off with organs. First off, you already eat organs. Muscle meats are organs. The skin is an organ. Gizzards, heart, liver, kidney, tongue, blood, tripe, thymus. Every part of an animal is an organ, technically. And what's interesting is that every single one of these organs has different nutrients in it. Of course it does, because it does different things in the body. And so what's important is that you're eating a diversity of these organs, not just the muscle meats. And interestingly enough, a lot of these traditional cultures, the muscle meats were the waste product. They were fed to the dogs. It was starvation food. The very first thing, the Plains Indians or the Plains indigenous people in North America here would do when they killed a buffalo is they would cut out its liver and they would squirt the gallbladder on the liver and eat it raw. The buffalo hunters that massacred the huge herds of bison in the 1800s, sometimes they would only take the tongue from the animal, and that was the most valuable part. They would shoot a 2,000-pound animal and take a 2-pound cut and let the rest to rot. So the muscle meats, which is what we're told to eat, they're super high in protein. They don't have a lot of fat. They're imbalanced. They're not a full nutrient profile. And so it's really important when you're eating an animal to try to eat as much of the animal as possible, because they all have different parts in it. And traditionally, the part of the animal you're eating was associated with the nutrients that were needed for that part of you. And so a lot of the sacred foods that were fed to people at different stages of their life corresponded to the needs of their own organs at those ages. So if you were a woman who was was lactating, and you would eat, the mammary glands. If you were a male and you wanted to be very fertile, you would eat the testicles and the genitalia of the male animals. If you were female, you would eat the female genitalia. If you had lung problems, you'd eat the lungs of the animal. If you wanted to be smart, you'd eat the brain, because it's almost entirely made of fat. And so you can start to use those very basic observations to start to incorporate more kinds of organs into your life. Now, of course, again, there's a huge difference between the quality of the organs. So you can see in these pictures here, only one of these looks healthy enough to eat, and that is, the pasture-raised organic. Just because something's organic and it's raised in a barn doesn't mean it's healthy. You want an animal that was raised outside in a natural environment, who is able to express its full animalness, and whatever that looks like. And you obviously want to avoid the poor quality organs from either unhealthy animals or animals that were raised in a industrial way. Coming back to the nutrient density of different organs, you might think, well, there's in a 2,000-pound cow, or even say 1,000-pound cow is more typical. The organ might only be 10 pounds. And so, that seems like it's way out of proportion. Yes, but, when you look at things like the B12 that's found in beef liver, there's over 3,000% of the recommended daily intake for vitamin B12. And so we can see that, if you have 100 grams of beef liver, that's enough vitamin B12 for a month. You don't need it very often. Same thing with, other riboflavins and other B vitamins. Copper was very high in liver. So is vitamin A. And when we look at the pork kidney or something like that, we see that it's again really high in selenium and other things. Every part of the animal has different nutrients in it, different vitamins, different minerals that are used in our own bodies for different functions as well. So you want to have a diversity of organs, and you don't need to have a whole lot of them. Just every couple months can be enough. So now, of course, you think, well, yeah, but I've tried to eat liver, I've tried to eat tripe. How do you make it taste good? They're awful. And I believe part of the reason why they don't taste very good is because they're so high in vitamins and minerals. So that metallic-y taste, if you eat liver that isn't cooked properly, that's the iron, that's the vitamin A, that's the copper. It tastes like you're eating a piece of tin. So the way that you hide that, or I don't even think it's not even a matter of hiding it, it's the way that you partner with that is by making sure that you've got enough fat. You try to mask the texture, and you use the correct spices. Those are the three things you need to think about when if you want to make organs taste good. The fat is partly to, I believe the reason why it's so intense and it's off-putting, or it's very strong, is if you cut it down with fat. Like, for example, the liver pate recipe that I have in my recipe book here, it's like there's almost 2 pounds there's almost 50% of the recipe is fat, and the rest is liver. And so when you eat it, it's delicious. There's nobody you could feed it to that wouldn't want it. But if you just eat a piece of raw liver, maybe if your taste buds have been adapted to that. But the other thing it's important is the texture. And so by grinding it up, by chopping it, by frying it, you can mask the kind of mushy or the chunky texture that a lot of organs have that can be unsavory to people. And of course, spices. For me, mustard is something that, fermented mustard particularly, totally masks the flavor of liver. Even if it's raw liver, if you put a little bit of mustard on it, there's some reaction that happens there. Maybe it's the enzymes. I don't know, but my body just loves it when when there's the correct amount of fat, I get the texture right, and the spices all together. It's fantastic. And so one of the simple recipes in the recipe book here is something I call the organs, ground organ stir fry, which is, you can turn it into patties, or you can just make it a stir fry, add to other things. But essentially what it is there's about 10 to 15% organs that I like to grind or chop up. So liver, kidney, heart, lung, basically whatever you can get, chop it up really, really fine, grind it up if you have a grinder, and put about 10 to 15% and mix that in with some other kind of ground meat, whether it's pork or beef, and then throw in the spices and some onions, maybe even some bone broth in there, and mix it up and fry. It is delicious. I've done almost a dozen samples where I'll take the exact same mix. The only thing that's different is one has organs and one doesn't. I cook it the same way. I just add the organs in at the very end. And I'll put these two things side by side, and I'll ask people, which one do you like more? And everybody says they like the one with organs more, even though they don't know. There's something about it. It has a richer flavor. It just feels better. It just really, energizing. And everybody agrees that the one with organs, they don't know why, because they don't know if there's organs in it, but they like that one better. And so the berries you can see there are also that I find is a really nice kind of a spice or a flavor to mix in there, along with the thyme, the salt, and the pepper, whatever spice flavors you like, to help augment and kind of balance out some of those flavors. Things like nutmeg, cloves, really play around with it. When you find the spice mix and the textures that work for you, there's almost no organ you can't eat. It's really quite exciting. Okay, so now for bones. What's the secret for bones? Well, to make bone broth, at a minimum, you need bones, water, and you need heat. That's all you need. And if you really want to get fancy, you can add some vinegar, which helps to bring the alkaline minerals out of the bones into the bone broth, because they're trying to find an equilibrium. You can add herbs, and you can add vegetables. Now, I myself, personally, I typically only do bones, water, heat, and vinegar. I don't add herbs or vegetables. The taste doesn't sit well with me. But you can play around with it, experiment. And the trick is that you want to take your bones in whatever size pot you've got, doesn't matter, pack the bones in as tightly as you can get it, so there's no spaces, and add water and cover the bones. Again, no matter what size pot you have, you don't need to measure anything. Just pack the bones in. Obviously, you don't want the bones to be right to the top of the pot, because you want to have at least 1 or 2 inches of water above the bones. And you want to cook it low and slow for 4 to 24 hours, and just taste it as you go along, and you feel your body will tell you when it's the right mix, and you'll find that changes. I started out with very long bone broths because that's what I liked, but now I typically go for about a 12-hour bone broth. I turn it on at night, and the next morning I turn it off and I process it. And what that processing looks like from start to finish, this is a pig head, which you might think is, oh my God, that's disgusting. But this is by far the most valuable part of a pig. Is absolutely delicious. You see the nose, the skin, the ear, it's full of cartilage, gelatin, all these amino acids, glycine, calcium that are all part of healing your gut, helping with digestion, helping your body to detoxify. All these different things are all found in a pig head. It's one of the only parts of apart from like a chicken foot where it has everything in it. Other bones, they typically have something like they only have marrow, or they only have this or that. The pig head has everything. And so what I do, again, you take a pot and you just cover the bones with water. In this case, the heads were frozen, and so once they're cooked a little bit, they settle down. I did add herbs to this particular one. Lovage is a really nice herb that grows very nicely in most climates. You cook it typically until the water kind of just reaches the edge of the bones. Again, low and slow. You don't want like a rolling boil, even in a crock pot, which you can use. You want to keep the lid cracked so that it doesn't get too hot, because that can start to, if meat gets too hot, it actually changes the chemical structure of them, and they can turn carcinogenic. That's why you're not supposed to eat charred or blackened meat. And so then what I do is a lot of people strain it, or they get spoons, or they do all this messy stuff. None of that. Get your hands out, get your hands into the pot. As soon as the temperature of the bone broth is down, cool enough that you can get your hands in there and not burn them. So it's still safe. It hasn't had, long time to stick in the danger zone. And just reach in there, squish everything up, mush the stuff around. If there's any hair or anything that was on the pig's face, pull that off. Find all those bones, put them out on a platter. Save those bones. You don't want to. We're going to get back to those later. And then make sure everything is squished up. And then you've got your bone broth, and you can do whatever you want with it. Now, if you're not cooking the bones that long, the meat might not fall apart, and you might just have a meat stock. That's totally fine too. But I highly recommend getting your hands. Then you'll find more of the bones that get all mixed up, and you'll also be able to squish up all the chunks of fat and cartilage and stuff with your hands. It's a great moisturizer for your hand. This is why your great grandmother had such great skin, because she was constantly digging through the turkey and the bone broth to get all those bones out. It's free moisturizer. Now with these bones, what you can do is you can burn them, you can compost them. If you cook, you can also cook them again, and you'll get different nutrients out of them. The more times you cook them, and eventually they'll literally just turn into dust or mush that you could actually consume. Some cultures did that. They cooked the bones, they ate the ashes to get more minerals and those building blocks of life into their diet. So when it comes to the recipe in my cookbook, one of my favorites is something I call bone broth poutine, or bone broth gravy, which is essentially you make a roux with flour and fat, and it's really important that it's pure fat and with no other liquid in it while you're browning your flour, and typically in a frying pan. You don't want any other moisture in there or any other liquid. Once you get your flour nice and brown, I like to add in bone broth, a cup or two, depending on how much gravy you're making. And that it turns into the thickest, richest, most luxurious gravy. One woman at one of my workshops, where I actually sampled all these different things, she told me, "My God, this gravy is so good, you could put it on a tire and it would taste delicious." This has been a game changer for me for all of my meats, and particularly for lean meat. So something like grass-fed beef, which tends to be a little on the dry side, and it's if it's not cooked just perfectly, it's not that enjoyable to eat. If you make a gravy with that, with the drippings from the beef roast and a little bit of bone broth and some nice herbs and spices, the beef roast transfer again. When you get the organs, the muscle meats is an organ, you get the right amount of fat with it, which comes in the gravy, in terms of the lard or the butter that you're using, as well as the bone broth. Something magical happens, and you stop wanting to put ketchup on everything and sauces on everything that are highly processed. You make a gravy from the juices of whatever you just cooked, and in this picture here, I've got several different images. These are all foods that are produced on the farm. Our cheeses, our potatoes, our vegetables, our meat, our gravy, our fermented veggies there, our creme fraiche. These are all things that we produce on the farm, and these are incredibly delicious meals they're gourmet, but they're very easy to make. I'm not a chef. I taught myself how to do all these things just through trial and error. And I made everything in these pictures here. It's very, very easy. Okay, the final recipe I want to share with you guys is how to render fat. So whether this is beef tallow, or pig lard, or poultry fat, or duck fat, or whatever it is, super simple. You need fat, you need heat, and those are the two minimum things. And you also need, you can use salt, more as a preservative later on. But to start off with, I like to take my fat and I like to chop it up into little pieces. And then I typically put it in a crock pot or something that I can do low and slow again. You don't want to get too hot, because if it starts to smoke, it means that you've gone past the smoke point and it's becoming carcinogenic. It's not healthy for you anymore. So you want to put it on low heat, and at a certain point, the lard will literally separate out from the kind of the cellulose structure of the fat, or the cracklins is what they're called. And then you can drain that out, and store your lard into whatever jars you want. And this is where if you want to store it at room temperature, you can mix in salt as it's cooling and kind of whip it up. It'll act as a preservative. You can also freeze these jars, and they'll keep for months in your freezer. But then the best part is you put these little cracklings back into a pan, and you fry them up until they get nice and crispy. You put some salts and spices on there. And now you've got lard that can be used to make gravy. It can be used to fry things in. Pork lard is just fantastic. It's a complete replacement for coconut oil in a cold climate like ours. It's almost the same chemical make. A pig is basically just a hairy coconut with legs. And this was the amount of this is kidney fat or leaf. It's the fat around the organs, the most nutrient dense fat on an animal, and this would be the amount of fat that you would get off of half of a pig would be in this little jar here. And for one person, that is enough fat for half of a year, if not longer, depending on how much you're using it. So those are three of my favorite recipes. You can find them in the recipe book here. That should have came with this video that you're watching right now. If not, you can go to my website, cohenfarm.ca, and you can sign up to our newsletter, and you'll get a free download as well. And there's 18 recipes in this recipe book. There's also a page that has a little bit of a write-up about Weston A. Price. It has a list of all those 11 principles if you want to start to follow those in your daily life, in your own diet. And the book is broken up into sections about organs, bones, and fats. So things like liver pate, how to make roasts properly, how to make raw liver pills, how to make pork skin puffs, how to dry salt your meat, how to make bone broth, soup, all these different things, as well as some excellent breakfasts and dessert dishes that are in this little recipe book as well. And I encourage you these are three of my favorites, but they all build off of each other, and you can really simply and quickly learn these skills and incorporate this into your daily diet. So to finish off with, I want to end on a really hopeful note. I know we've talked about a lot of, for almost over 100 years, we've been lied to about the foods that we should be eating. That's caused untold suffering and death in our culture. And so the question is, can this physiological degeneration be reversed? And the answer is absolutely. If you do research into the Weston A. Price Foundation, you'll find that parents that had terrible teeth problems, braces and things like that, if they make a shift to these traditional principles of healthy diets, at least several months before conception, let alone birth, the babies, and for both the man and the woman, because the man might not be growing the baby, but he is contributing to the growth of a new baby. And when you make those shifts soon enough, your body can stock up in those vitamins and minerals, so that when you create the new body inside of you, those babies can be healthy, and they can totally reverse the degeneration in a single generation, which is absolutely fantastic. And the same thing with the cavities and things like that. I've healed cavities I used to have horrible teeth problems. I've seen cavities in myself disappear. Dr. Weston A. Price had a protocol where he used cod liver oil and grass-fed butter and his 11 principles to heal. I believe there's one girl who had over 60 cavities in her mouth, and within a few months they were gone, just by following these. Our bodies have the ability to heal themselves, which is really exciting. And the other piece I want to finish off on is what about the ecological degeneration that we're seeing all around the world right now? The loss of soil life, the biodiversity loss, all these different things. Can that be reversed? And the answer is, of course. And this is an incredibly simple observation point to prove, in that there's one of the most common pieces of literature that's being quoted these days is an article in 2015 by the Science Advances scientific journal which was looking into is Earth in its sixth mass extinction event. So basically, there's a lot of evidence that's showing that insect life, mammalian life, all life on this planet is dying off. So we're losing species at an incredible rate. Well, of course, that's a natural process. Organisms are always dying and going extinct because the planet is constantly changing. But what they found is that those rates were hundreds, if not thousands, of times above the normal levels of extinction rates. And so what this article concluded is that, yes, Earth is in its sixth mass extinction event right now, which is terrifying. And that's directly related to the way we are feeding ourselves on the planet, as we looked at before in those pictures. But the story from Science Advances, of the study is incredibly hopeful for two reasons. The first is that, well, the 50% or more of the planet's species have been exterminated in a mass event at least 5 times before, whether by an asteroid or a supervolcano or a pole reversal or a coronal mass ejection. At some points, if you look back at the different mass extinction events in history, up to 90% of the organisms on the planet were wiped out in one fell swoop, sometimes in a single day. And so, but what's interesting is that, at least 5 times before, more than half the species on the planet were wiped out. And yet it's come back at least 5 times. And if you look back at the fossil record, every time life becomes more complex. At one point, humans didn't exist, which humans are not necessarily special, but we are certainly a complex and an evolved form of life compared to a single-celled organism. And so not only is life anti-fragile to these disturbances, but it actually gets better. It thrives in them. It can be taken back to the brink of extinction and just get better. And the second reason why that study is incredibly important is that, unlike the past 5 extinction events, which were caused by massive impacts or basically death rays from the sun, or the North and South Pole reversing and collapsing the electromagnetic protection from the other cosmic impacts, or volcanoes blackening out the sun for hundreds of years. This time, the thing that's causing the sixth mass extinction is us. It's humans. We are as powerful as asteroids, as the sun, as supervolcanoes. And so when we ask ourselves, what would it be like if we took that power and we stopped using it to fight with the natural world, to try to control it and bend it to our will, and instead we use it to partner with it, to improve the biodiversity, to improve soil health, to improve the water cycle? What would happen to the nutrient density of our food? What would happen to the well-being of all life around us? And so if we can go head to head with one of the most powerful forces of the known universe, because at a certain point, planet Earth didn't even exist. At a certain point, we were just stardust. The planet was just stardust, and it coalesced because of the gravitational pull of our sun. And after billions of years, it cooled enough so that bacteria that came in from other space dust was able to land on it and slowly evolve over billions of years to the point where we are here today. And every couple 100,000 years, it got knocked back to almost square one again, and it just kept bouncing on. There's some force in the universe that wants to get better. It wants to grow and improve on itself. And we are going head to head with that force, and we are winning right now because of how powerful we are. What could it be like if we partnered with that force? And so I believe that we are literally eating ourselves and our planet to death. And the most powerful thing we can do is to start eating the change we want to see in the world. There's nothing that has that every single person on this planet does it. And if we all made the shift to moving towards more nutrient-dense foods that were produced on regenerative farms, that were where the animals and the plants were raised ethically, we could completely transform our planet in a very short time, in the same way that we can, and we could also transform our health. And so there's this interesting connection that in order to heal ourselves, if we want to be healthy, we can't just keep popping vitamins and hoping these problems are going to go away, because they won't. There'll be something else that'll stop. So in order to heal ourselves, we need to heal the planet. But also, in order to heal the planet, we need to heal ourselves, because the healthier we are, the better we can be stewards of this planet. And so I believe that organs, bones, and fats, because they've been so demonized, and most people are so terrified to use them, I believe they are a critical part of this regenerative agriculture and regenerative health movement that's happening right now. And I hope that what I've shared with you today is going to help empower you with the permission and the skills and some basic recipes so that you can take this information and start using it in your own life to help heal yourself and heal the planet. And I'll end on the final word from Dr. Weston A. Price himself. These were his dying words when somebody asked him, what do we do? There's just so much misinformation, and there's so much just garbage science out there in the world. What do we do? How do we fight this this battle that we're in right now? And he said, you teach, you teach, you teach. And so if you found something valuable in the message that I've shared here today, if you find a recipe that you enjoy in my book, if you go onto the Weston A. Price website or my website and you find a resource that inspires you, share with others, educate yourself. We all need to become teachers in this movement. And by eating and by teaching, we will turn this thing around. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.